Welcome to Session 4. This session addresses a wide range of specific information and requirements concerning our A&M clinical teaching semester. We will go back and forth between the handbook and miscellaneous handouts, so have all of your hard copies assembled and in the correct order. On this first slide, you see the top half of page 8 from the handbook. Have your copy of page 8 from the handbook in front of you. It is entitled Clinical Teaching Assignments. The first item in the list refers to the acknowledgement page that is on page 4 in the handbook. Clinical teachers are to sign and give this page to you, acknowledging that they have read the clinical teaching handbook, the information on the need for liability insurance, etc. You are to collect these at the orientation seminar and keep them until the semester has ended, at which time you may dispose of them. Find the section towards the middle of page 8 that says Organize a Clinical Teaching Notebook using a large 3-ringed binder with individual dividers. At your orientation seminar, make it clear to your clinical teachers that if they have not already done so, it is time to organize this notebook according to these guidelines and keep it on their desk or designated space in their classrooms. Let them know that you will need access to it each time that you observe. Tell them that you will spot check the lesson plans filed in this notebook and inspect the attendance log on each visit. Stress to your clinical teachers that the log is their daily responsibility, not the cooperating teachers. Arrival and departure times must be recorded. Also stress that they are to secure their cooperating teachers' initials on a daily basis to show agreement with the documentation, and at the end of the semester they must secure a signature from you, the supervisor, at the final conference. On the next slide, you see the remainder of page 8 from the handbook. At the top of the page, you see the section entitled Journal. At the orientation seminar, discuss the importance of journaling as explained in this bullet. It is fine to make journaling a requirement. My clinical teachers begin their journaling with week 2. They generate one journal entry for each day. The journal entry can be about a specific lesson, a particular student, no name included, the day in general, a classroom management goal or issue, a successful or humorous event from the day, a problem or a concern, etc. Once the first full responsibility begins, they have the option of replacing the daily journal entry with a weekly list of short-term goals. This weekly list of short-term goals must be recorded in the journaling spiral or clinical teaching notebook at the beginning of each week. If the option of weekly goals is chosen, one journal entry must be written at the end of the week reflecting on that week's goals. In summary, this option consists of one list of short-term goals and one journal entry per week. Many clinical teachers find this option quite helpful. I read each journal entry and initial it so my clinical teachers know that I have read it. Journaling forces the clinical teacher to think about what is happening in the classroom, and reading these journal entries helps me get to know each clinical teacher in an individual manner. I learn a lot by reading these journal entries. The next major topic on the page is entitled eCampus. All of our clinical teachers are required to go online during the semester and respond to several discussion questions and read discussion entries from other clinical teachers. This is their eCampus online requirement for the semester. You, as the university supervisor, do not have any responsibilities with this requirement other than reminding the clinical teachers to do it. Clinical teachers will receive information about eCampus as well as other official clinical teaching updates through their TAMU accounts. So, remind your clinical teachers to check their A&M TAMU accounts regularly for information from the Office of Field Experiences. If one of your clinical teachers does not meet a deadline for an eCampus assignment, you will receive an email asking you to contact that clinical teacher and remind him or her to complete the assignment that is missing. The next slide is the formal observation. Find this form on page 16 in the handbook. Our formal observation form has been adapted to reflect portions of the Texas Teacher Evaluation and Support System, referred to as TTES. You will use this form for critiquing your formal observations. You already know that you will formally observe each clinical teacher a total of 4 times during the semester, 2 times prior to the midpoint and at least 2 times between the midpoint conference and the final conference. Additional observations may be needed if a clinical teacher is experiencing difficulties. You also know that a pre-conference is conducted prior to each formal observation and that each observation is at least 45 minutes in length. Now let's take a look at the heading on the form. For each of your formal observations, you will need to record the date of the pre-conference, the date and time in and out for the observation, as well as the beginning and ending time of the follow-up conference. Also take note of the rating scale for each descriptor, as well as the overall rating number for each lesson observed. Prior to each observation, it is suggested that you print hard copies of this form. While observing, you will record your feedback on this form. By using carbon paper, you will have a copy to leave with the clinical teacher. And yes, I know this is really high tech, but it is quick and it does work. Use your written feedback from each formal observation, or using your written feedback from each formal observation, you will conduct a follow-up conference with the clinical teacher. The conference might be face-to-face immediately following the lesson, or by phone at a later time that's more convenient for both of you. If it is a face-to-face conference, give the clinical teacher a hard copy of the completed observation form at the end of the conference. If the follow-up conference will be later by phone, then leave a hard copy of the completed observation form on the clinical teacher's desk before you leave. Focus on self-evaluation during each follow-up conference. Have the clinical teacher reflect on what went well and what did not. Use the feedback from the clinical teacher as a springboard to guide this follow-up conference. Remember to note the beginning time and ending time for each follow-up conference. You will need this information later when filling out the online form. After the follow-up conference, you will use the link provided to you by the Office of Field Experiences to enter your data from the observation to the online formal observation form. And this needs to be done within 48 hours of the observation. And once you click Submit, your typed data will automatically be emailed to the clinical teacher. It is now the clinical teacher's responsibility to type and submit reflections about this lesson. See the reflection questions at the bottom of the observation form. The clinical teacher is to complete each reflection within 48 hours of receiving the automated typed document. Once the clinical teacher hits Submit, an electronic copy of the information you entered online, including the clinical teacher's reflections, will automatically be sent to the cooperating teacher, the building principal, A&M, etc. No action is required by the recipients of this final electronic copy. It is simply an attempt by TEA to keep everyone informed of how the clinical teacher is progressing. Just so you know, you and the clinical teacher will also receive an electronic copy of this final documentation. The next slide is the midpoint final evaluation form. Find this form on page 17 in the handbook. This midpoint final evaluation will be used to document each clinical teacher's progress and will guide the midpoint conference, which is conducted during weeks 6 or 7. This same form will be used again at the final conference during weeks 13 and 14. This form has also been adapted to reflect portions of the Texas Teacher Evaluation and Support System known as T-TESS. Notice the rating scale that will be used for each descriptor. Also take note of the 4 domains: planning, instruction, learning environment, professional practices, and responsibilities. You will give prior notification through an email to the cooperating teacher noting a day and time for the 3-way midpoint conference, and do the same later in the semester for the final conference. You and the cooperating teacher will each fill out this form separately and bring the completed forms to the midpoint conference and again to the final conference at the end of the semester. At the midpoint and again at the final conference, you will meet with the cooperating teacher first for approximately 10 minutes to compare numbers on your completed evaluation forms. The numbers may or may not be the same. As long as the numbers are consecutive, all is well. In other words, a 2 and a 3 or a 3 and a 4 would be fine. If the numbers are a 2 and a 4, then discuss the reason for the wide gap and make the needed changes. Following this brief meeting with the cooperating teacher, have the clinical teacher join you and the cooperating teacher. Conduct a 15 to 20 minute 3-way conference. As noted earlier, this midpoint final evaluation provides structure for the conferences. At the midpoint, the three-way conference is focused on the clinical teacher's strengths and areas for growth or refinement as indicated on the evaluation form. At the final conference, keep the focus on the areas where the clinical teacher has grown, as indicated by the numbers on the evaluation form. Mention the areas that will continue to improve with experience. It is also a good time to address interviewing tips. Give the cooperating teacher ample opportunity for input during both the midpoint and final conferences. At the midpoint conference and again at the final conference, the clinical teacher will receive a hard copy of this evaluation form from you and one from the cooperating teacher. Once the midpoint conference is complete, and again later when the final conference is complete, you go online using the link provided by the Office of Field Experiences and enter the numbers you have on your form. Cooperating teachers do not enter their numbers online from either the midpoint or the final conference. When you are entering comments from the midpoint final conference onto the online form, be sure to include specific comments from the cooperating teacher. Make this obvious by prefacing those comments with the cooperating teacher said or the cooperating teacher commented that. Again, remember to enter your numbers and comments after both the midpoint conference and again after the final conference. After the final conference, there is another important item left for cooperating teachers and clinical teachers. Remind each cooperating teacher to go online to evaluate his or her university supervisor and each clinical teacher to evaluate his or her university supervisor and cooperating teacher online. The Office of Field Experiences will send the proper links to the cooperating teachers and clinical teachers. You could also forward the links to cooperating teachers and clinical teachers. The next slide is entitled Guidelines for Observations, Midpoint Final Conferences. Find your copy of this miscellaneous handout. Again, it is entitled Guidelines for Observations, Midpoint Final Conferences. The basics of what you need to remember about observations, including TEA requirements, and midpoint and final conferences are all summarized on this one page. And for this reason, I refer to it as the go-to page on documentation requirements for observations and or midpoint final conferences. With a few exceptions, everything on this page has already been mentioned during this audio session. So we will go on to the next slide at this time. For this slide, you will need your copy of page 26 from the handbook. It is entitled Growth Probation Plan. If a clinical teacher is experiencing significant problems, the university will observe this clinical teacher more often than the minimum number of observations. If these significant problems occur over and over with no improvement noted, it may be time for a growth plan. If a problem is caught early enough, a growth plan will generally solve the issue or problem. Your access to the online growth plan is through a link which is on the very same page where you gain access to the online formal observation form. Record your documentation for the growth plan on this online form and notify Kim Parrish. Be specific with the problematic areas, suggest intervention strategies, a timeline, and any other pertinent information. For the rare occasions when a growth plan does not successfully solve the issues, confer with the Office of Field Experiences to receive guidance before proceeding with the probation plan. Just so you know, situations requiring a probation plan are extremely rare. For the next slide, you will want your copy of page 27 from the handbook. It is the clinical teacher's attendance log. Clinical teachers will enter their arrival and departure times for each day of clinical teaching. The day for career fair will not need an arrival or departure time. It is the clinical teacher's responsibility to keep the log up to date and ask his or her cooperating teacher to initial each day. The clinical teacher's initial will indicate that the data entered is correct. You will monitor this requirement by spot checking the log during each visit or observation. Be sure to sign the attendance logs during the final conferences. For the next slide and the following 3 slides, you will need your copy of the miscellaneous handout entitled Supervisor's Weekly Plan of Action. This handout is 4 pages in length. This is a week-by-week guide as to what a Texas A&M University supervisor does during the semester. Use it as a reference. Since I am a university supervisor, I've included items in this document that reflect what I personally do in addition to what is required. Make adjustments as you go that will fit your style of supervision. Just make sure that you are fulfilling all of the basic requirements. Since this document is quite detailed and an easy read, we will not spend time discussing every single detail. Aren't you glad? We will, however, quickly skim through each main heading so that you will have an idea of the type of information that is included there, and you can go back later and read it in detail. Week 1 includes miscellaneous information about the orientation seminar for clinical teachers, along with suggestions of what to discuss or emphasize during the seminar. Remember, you are setting the tone for the semester. Be specific with your expectations, the deadlines, the requirements, etc. And let's just skip down to suggestion number 3. Clarify that the official last day is for those who exhibit good effort in all areas, have perfect attendance, incorporate suggestions, maintain a professional attitude, demonstrate progress with planning, instruction, classroom management, etc. Number 4, stress that a 14-plus week, which is 71 days, clinical teaching semester is earned. Let them know that if a clinical teacher has not met all requirements in the 14-plus weeks provided, that extra time is certainly available. Also inform them that the need for additional time in the clinical teaching semester is extremely rare because our students are self-motivated. Please note number 5, 6, and 7 in this list as you discuss absences with your clinical teachers at the orientation seminar. Point out that the state of Texas requires 70 days in the classroom in order to be certified to teach, and A&M requires an additional day for the career fair, so the total is 71 required days. All days of absence must be made up. These days are made up after the last official day of clinical teaching. Tell your clinical teachers to pay special attention to the attendance information on page 7 of the handbook. Share that absences due to taking certification exams or substituting are considered unexcused. 1 day is allowed for a professional interview and is an excused absence. That is important because excused days are made up on a basis of 1-to-1, while unexcused days are made up on the basis of 1-to-2. Inform clinical teachers that a daily attendance log must be maintained, and remember to stress that this is their responsibility, not the cooperating teachers. It is also their responsibility to get their cooperating teacher to initial it on a daily basis. In order to qualify for graduation, an accurate attendance log must be submitted at the end of the semester. Discuss how absences are reported. Explain that in addition to notifying the cooperating teacher, the university supervisor, and the school office about an absence, clinical teachers are to officially record each day of absence online using the student data portal provided by the Office of Field Experiences. In addition, the makeup day for each absence must be recorded in the portal. Now let's look back at the bullets. Note that the high visit is optional but highly recommended, and why. There's information about the second seminar, which is mandatory. Note that weekly updates are optional, but it is wise to send them. It is equally wise to send updates, reminders, etc. to your cooperating teachers on an as-needed basis. There's information about weekly schedules, such as when they're due, and options on how they are to be submitted to you. Now moving on to the next slide. Now weeks 2 through 4. There is a suggestion concerning when to begin observing, which is to wait until week 3. There's information about what to observe for the first formal observation and the observation form to use, which is the formal observation form. This observation form has been adapted to reflect portions of the t-tests. There is also information about the length of each observation, which is at least 45 minutes. Also, what to do before and after each observation. You already know to conduct a pre-observation conference The method is your choice, in person, by phone, or electronically. A follow-up conference is also required for each observation. The follow-up conferences can be face-to-face or by phone, not electronically though, like the pre-conference. Self-evaluation is emphasized. Also provide the clinical teacher with a copy of your written documentation. There is information about the online requirement. You are to transfer your handwritten feedback to the online version of the formal observation form, and details about this are listed in this bullet. There is a bullet about the importance of written feedback from the cooperating teacher. Remind your cooperating teachers that clinical teachers need regular written feedback. You will need to emphasize that each clinical teacher should receive some type of written feedback at least once a week from his or her cooperating teacher. By the end of week 4, each clinical teacher should have one complete formal observation by you, his or her university supervisor. The last bullet addresses the growth probation plan, which we've already discussed. Moving on to the next slide. Weeks 5 and 6. The second formal observation is discussed here. The last bullet is about thinking ahead to week 7, which is generally midpoint conference week. You will want to ask your clinical teachers to acquire information from their cooperating teachers about conflicts that might occur during conference periods for week 7, and ask them to record these conflicts on their week 7 schedules. Now, week 7, there is a reminder about prior notification to cooperating teachers about the midpoint conferences and a discussion about preparing for the midpoint conference. The format for the midpoint conference is discussed here. This is a good review of details that were discussed earlier in this audio session. Also, the online requirement of recording your data from the midpoint final evaluation is discussed. This is important. Be sure to include specific comments from the cooperating teacher. Make this obvious by prefacing the comments with the cooperating teacher said, or the cooperating teacher commented that, such and such. Now for the last slide in this audio session, weeks 8 through 10. There's information here about the third formal observation and second environment, which is optional. Second environment is simply observing in other classrooms. Weeks 11 through 13, there is information here about the fourth formal observation and thinking ahead to week 14, as well as information about a wrap-up seminar, which is optional. Week 14 will extend into week 15 in order to total 71 days. There is information here about prior notification to cooperating teachers about the final conference. Also, the guidelines for the final conference. There's also information about the important last step for cooperating teachers and clinical teachers, which is to go online to evaluate you and clinical teachers. And the important last step for university supervisors, which is to go online to enter your numbers and comments from the final conference onto the midpoint final evaluation form. Again, be sure to include specific comments from the cooperating teacher. Remember that this document is an excellent week-by-week reference or resource for you on the basic requirements. I hope that each of you will take time to read through this entire document and refer to it during this semester as needed. You are welcome to email me with questions. My contact information is at the end of the document. I know that all this information is overwhelming. This concludes Session 4.